Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Welcome to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast, a podcast by emerging writers for emerging writers, because sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like dirty, dirty cons. I'm Paddy Boylan. I haven't hosted for a hot minute, but here I am. It's fun to be back. And joining me are my illustrious co-hosts, Burnham.
Hello, I'm Ali. Quick introduction from me. I have a background in screenwriting. I'm working on a few screenplays at the moment, knee deep in those. But I also write prose, and I also find myself teaching every now and then screenwriting.
And Alex Eldridge.
I am an author. I've published one collection of short stories called Golden Hour. It's on Amazon, and also obviously contributed to the New Mythic collection. And also I've recently had a story published in the Big Issue, the literary edition of that, the fiction edition, I beg your pardon.
And I'm a creative writing teacher, editor, technical writer, and in theory, I'm writing fiction and writing a novel.
Aren't we all?
Well, some of us more so than others. Ali, you were talking about how you've got like story cards scattered all over your floor at the moment for plotting.
Yes. No, it's very exciting because I've had it plotted out for like 2 months, just haunting me on my floor, which is good motivation because I'm like, the story's there. The story will be done when my floor is clean. And I'm just about to hit the midpoint. So literally half the cards are gone. And that's very satisfying. Good mentally. So I'm like, I'm cleaning and writing at the same time as my floor gets cleaner.
That feels like an actionable tip. Yeah. Make the story a mess. And then as you clean it up.
And then you have a finished story at the end. Yeah.
Oh. Quite useful. Phoenix, Matan, and James can't make it today. They're off having fabulous adventures, so it's just us three. And today, we're going to be exploring a pair of fairly powerful devices that you can use in your writing to build tension, to move a story toward a climax and make it seem like it's going somewhere, and also for you as a writer to make sure your story stays on track, moving in a direction so you don't do what I did and bloat it out to 200,000 words without anything really happening.
That's a lot of words.
It wasn't even finished.
I think you've been in a similar boat though, right, Ali?
Oh yeah, no, I can't talk.
Yeah, it's But anyway, before we get into those devices, what have you guys been reading, watching, doing lately in the interim?
I actually finished this quite a while ago, but I haven't had a chance to talk about it on the podcast. I guess just the timing of it. But this is me finally with the opportunity to gush about Succession.
Oh yes.
Nathan and I waited until the final season dropped, so we knew Succession was the biggest thing, the newest thing, the greatest thing. But like we're like, at this point, let's wait for season 4 so we can just binge it all, and then we can watch season 4 as it drops. So we did that. Incredibly satisfying. Oh my gosh. So I won't spend too much talking about what it is. I'll just tell you all to go watch it. It has premium good television drama, probably the best you're going to find out there at the minute. And I'll just talk about the way it made Nathan and I feel. I feel like at the end of season 1, like literally that episode ended and we're just gasping. Like we're looking at each other and we're like, holy hell, that was just guttural reaction to it. And it then continues to remain good dialogue, good drama, but it just saves its punch moments for the end of each season. It continued to meet that formula each time. We probably season 4 again, we had the similar just leaving us breathless, leaving us speechless. That kind of really good television.
At the risk of making this a whole thing, I saw the first 4 episodes expecting to love it. I really didn't like it.
Oh,
I really didn't like it at all.
About it?
It's going to take a while, but maybe we can save this for another episode. But
because if it was a taste thing of you don't care watching terrible people being terrible,
that's some of it. Yeah,
I understand that as a genre. Because we watched the I'm going to forget what it's called. What's the resort drama?
White Lotus.
White Lotus. So we watch White Lotus. So we're like, look, we see why it's good, But also that was probably just on the edge for me, being like, why are we watching people being terrible? So I get how that's like a taste thing, and Succession's walking the same street. But I feel like there was just enough tension, goodness, characters with minor redeemable, lovable moments to keep drawing you
just
in.
enough.
Just enough, yeah.
Totally.
I don't know, maybe I should see the whole thing.
If you can stick out at least season 1 for me, so you can line yourself up for this perfection of a character arc that is season 1, then you, if you hate it still, come back to me.
Okay. I think you might have talked me into it, actually. I might give it another shot. Alex, what have you been up to?
I've been reading a lot of nonfiction recently, actually. What have I been going through? Listening to an audiobook by James Nestor called Breath, about literally breathing and how we're doing it like wrong. And how our jaws are all too small, and that affects how we breathe. It's a whole thing.
Interesting.
So I've been doing that. Recently my girlfriend Liz put me onto. She's been like, "Hey, this is a seminal middle grade series that I was really into. You should read it." And having last time she recommended me something, which was The Hunger Games, I was like, "This is really good." I was like, "Yeah, I'll give it a go." So the series in particular she's asked me to go over, which is topical enough, is Percy Jackson. So I've been doing that and just reading through that and being like, okay, this is like we've talked about.
So
this before.
So it's not a bargain basement Harry Potter.
No, it's really not.
Okay.
It's really not. Not from what I can see. It's like the character. It's very the character's like got a lot of like gumption, and he's it's still middle grade fiction, but like it's not like I get to the end of the chapter and go like, all right. It doesn't do any of those dumb like takeaways. You know, that classic Goosebumps, like, and then they heard a noise coming from the attic. It was Dad, like on the new. It doesn't do as much of that. So no, I'm enjoying that so far. Just but otherwise just slogging through the Aurealis
I love
stuff.
the Percy Jackson version of "we heard a noise and then it was Dad" was this whole like pantheon.
Well, I mean that
Wow.
that's a bit. I've actually only just started, so I haven't even got up to that bit. But I understand. I understand the general premise.
I feel like I do this in every episode, but I think maybe we should do an episode about those like chapter kind of cliffhangers, having a cliffhanger at the end of a chapter to keep you wanting to go to the next one.
Yeah.
The Dan Brown analysis.
The Dan Brown. Yeah.
Doing a Dan.
We can call it the Dan Brown code.
The Dan Brown code. That's great, actually.
The Brown note.
Sorry. What to say about Dan Brown? For myself, I've been reading some really good historical fiction in Bernard Cornwell, who's I don't know what you call the series, but the book is called The Sword of Kings. Really cliched name, but it's great. It's an Iron Age Britain. It's got shield walls. It's got longboats crashing into each other.
Nice. I'm already sold.
Laconic characters staring out at thunderstorms and just nodding to themselves. And it's really well written. It's like a guilty pleasure, but it's got the writing of something with heft.
What's it called? I'm already sold.
Sword of Kings by Bernard Cornwell. It's a whole series. I love it. I recommend it.
I've never met anyone who's read Bernard Cornwell and been like, nah, that was trash. Like everyone who I've ever met, I haven't read it myself, so I can't speak to it, but everyone who I've met who's read it has been like, yeah, it's really good.
It's really good.
And very readable.
Had like a whole shelf at the last airport I was at too, because I love studying airport bookstores. Because
yes.
They've got to be like really just hard-hitting niche. This is what's hot. This is what's good. Like there's no time to like fuck spiders in an airport bookstore. They're just like, take this if you want this genre. And
there's no time to what?
Sorry, leaned on a very Australian saying just then.
I love how you just slipped that in there.
Like, I'm not here to fuck spiders. Have you heard of that saying?
Okay, yeah, I have.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that's
It's
the
good.
same energy you bring to an airport bookstore.
Okay.
Here's the comparison I'm making.
That's not used nearly enough.
No, it's not.
In conclusion, Bernard Cornwell, had his whole shelf.
And he deserves that. It's real good stuff. Anyway, speaking of a completely different author, have you guys heard of Chuck Palahniuk?
Yeah.
Ali, you ever Chuck Palahniuk?
Yes, nope, he's a name that, screenwriting law. Yeah.
I'll bet he is, yes.
Yeah.
Author of Fight Club, Survivor, Choke, Invisible Monsters, and others besides. Turns out he has a lot to say about writing, funnily enough, and a very good blog. I was looking for material to teach one of my creative writing classes, and I found his article on a pair of techniques called clocks and guns. They're techniques for building tension and for moving towards a climax. And I think they're the kind of things that as writers, we might already know it instinctually, and we've definitely seen it, but we might not have a name for it or be able to define it. And he's not the one that came up with these ideas, but I think he did a really good job at kind of clarifying and cementing them. So what I want to do is explore clocks and guns according to his definitions and see if we can't make some sense out of that. So had you guys heard of or come across either of these concepts before this episode?
So for me, definitely clocks. Probably, reading into it, it wasn't the exact definition I know it as, but it seems close enough. So even when I'm teaching, I use the term the ticking clock.
Yep.
So how I knew a ticking clock was the time pressure that's being placed on the characters. They have to achieve a certain thing or they will fail. It's the lose condition is getting closer and closer.
The lose condition, yeah.
A lose condition is getting closer and closer. And it's literally the clock is the easiest term because it can be a bomb counting down if we think of it in our head. But if this bus falls below a certain speed, the bus will explode.
That's one of the examples I have. Yes, perfect. Because we
Perfect.
know eventually the bus is going to run out of fuel. They can't keep going at 50 miles per hour forever. So, and for those who might not know, this is the plot to the film Speed.
Yeah, and so I think the slight definition when I was reading more into Chuck's clock, it was more of a clock promising that the climax is going to arrive.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it essentially is the same thing. I guess I've been using it as a more of a stakes tool because stakes is this is the thing that'll be lost, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that with Chuck's definition. It is just a promise has happened and now there's a timer on that promise and the plot's barreling towards it.
Yeah, which is such a nice definition because I'd always thought about it as like a lot of movies have countdowns, yeah. But no,
Yeah.
sometimes it's just like this thing is going to happen and we know at the climax it's going to happen. What happens on the journey to get there?
Mhm.
Alex, what about you? The clocks or guns as concepts. Is this something you've encountered or that you've played with or?
Yeah, I think I haven't thought as much about the clocks aspect. I feel like depending on what genre you're writing in and what structure it takes, I feel like that's fairly endemic to a lot of stuff. The one example of a clock that I thought of that it sort of makes sense, and maybe I'm jumping the gun here, but so to speak, would be Dante's Inferno, the original
Okay.
text, just going through the circles of hell. It's like it's made very clear at the
Ooh.
beginning, like, hey, you are going through hell. There's all these things we have to get to. Tartarus, I believe, is the bottom one. I might be mixing my mythologies there, but is where Satan is. That's basically where the exit tube to heaven is, or to limbo at least. So you got to go down to go back up. So that was my but yeah, I think a lot of stuff is, at least in his definition, is endemic to how it is. Like we've got to catch the killer. The killer's, they're stalking their next victim, and it becomes apparent that they're getting closer and closer to that. That is kind of more of a ticking time bomb. But even something like Harry Potter, just the school year running its course. Like we know that we're going to reset at the end of the school year. I guess you don't necessarily know at the beginning of the first book, but it becomes very apparent that that's a trope. And the gun. This is a term I use all the time, but I'm totally blanking on the guy's name.
Chekhov.
Is it Chekhov's gun?
Yes.
That's a tool that I think about all the time when I'm writing. Just in terms of like, hey, if you show the thing, you have to use the thing. It can be no loose ends. And in the way that I like to write, I like to have things very, very spare and very condensed. So if you show the thing, you got to use the thing. And it might be literally a gun. It might be a tool. It might be, it could be anything, but basically something that's saying like, hey, we're showing you this is going to be made use of at the end, probably in some dramatic and potentially apocalyptic way.
Yep. Chuck describes it really well as the thing that will instigate the chaos, and he uses the chaos in air quotes. Yeah, I think Chuck did a really, really good job describing this. And for anyone that wants to check out the blog, Chuck, I'm not going to spell his name. Just look up Chuck Polinock, look up his Substack, you'll find it. It's a Polish surname. It's a little tricky. Anyway, let's, yeah, I mean, you're right. These are clocks and guns. But there's a little more to each, which I think makes them very interesting and very, I mean, if we can get the descriptions and definitions, we can start to drill down on how to use them in specific ways. So let's start with clocks. Chuck defines it as anything that limits a story's length by suggesting that it will end at a certain time. So in other words, it suggests when the story is going to climax. And as the story moves along, it's often not a literal clock, but sometimes it is. You can tell that the timeline is shortening and shortening and shortening. So you get this sense of, oh boy, here it comes. The thing, whatever it is coming up. I've written and read some works that don't have much of a clock. There isn't much of a sense that time is counting down. And I think you feel it. Most works have some kind of a clock to an extent. I don't know if you guys have any experience with that. Maybe you've written something that doesn't really have a time constraints, which is kind of...
Yeah, I definitely relate to the experience of I'm reading something and you're just not quite certain, like, what's going to happen next or why things are happening. I've usually boiled it down to it like if the character's not really clear with their objectives. Like I think if there's a very clear clock, it's probably tied to what the protagonist is trying to do, right? They're either trying to beat the clock or they're working in tandem with the clock.
Yeah.
So it's a symptom of one is a symptom of the other. If the protagonist doesn't have a clear goal, there's probably not a clear stated clock either. But in saying that, I decided to think about, have I ever organically used a clock in the way Chuck describes it? And I'm thinking of my most recent manuscripts, and I'm like, I don't actually think I do. Not if it's a literal thing. I guess I tend to think of it as character tensions.
Mm-hmm.
I've got certain characters, they're bouncing off each other, they're boiling. Each interaction is worse than the next, is a promise to the audience that eventually this cannot last. This is not a stasis. This will erupt. So
yeah,
in terms of a promise of chaos, that's probably the closest thing I have to a clock. But
I kind of want to call that a soft clock. It's clock adjacent.
Clock.
Yeah.
Rather than a hard external...
Yes.
A hard clock, a hard external ticking force. I agree. It has elements of the time pressure without it being something that's the characters are actively aware of and in opposition of.
Yep. Yeah. Here's an example of a hard clock. Let's think about the evil supervillain that tells the president that they only have 24 hours until the doomsday device detonates. That's a very firm definition. We know how much time there is, and often even like the president will glance up and the audience can see there's a clock on the wall ticking down. That is the most literal example I can think of a ticking clock. For anyone out there who's played video games, think about how much more tense those parts of games are where you've only got a certain amount of time to complete the thing. Looking at you every underwater level ever.
Yeah. I remember playing Wario Land on the Game Boy, and there's this thing where there's like a lava thing going before, and it stressed me out so much. Like I couldn't do it for a really long time, and then I just
I remember Prince of Persia being the one that got me with the literal time mechanics. And if it was just a wall puzzle, climb the puzzle, do the jumping puzzle without a timer, I probably could have done it in the 20 seconds it allows you to do it. But because you're thinking about the timer clicking down for 20, suddenly the puzzle is so much harder and you're panicking.
Yep.
And I remember finding that so very frustrating.
Yeah. But I think watching it externally, but when you watch characters go through that frustration, we all enjoy pain. So
love it.
So I watched a really good movie. It actually wasn't a good movie. I really enjoyed it, but I did really get a lot out of it, and it had it kind of was a hard clock. So it's called Fall. I'd like to preface it by saying it is not a great movie, but I really liked it. It's a horror movie, thriller. It's about basically these girls who go and climb this giant tower, and the tower is really old. They climb to the top of it. Lo and behold, the ladder falls down. They are stuck at the top of this tower that's the size of the World Trade Center. Like it's ridiculously tall.
They climbed a ladder.
They climb up this. It's just like it's like a social media stunt thing. They're like, oh look, we climbed the top of this thing, and it becomes this soft clock because basically they're running out of batteries to do things to contact people. We've established there's no physical way for them to get down themselves. It can't be done. And then also there's the like literal circling vultures that are going around them. And like the emotional and character elements of it were done really poorly, but that element alone, and also the fact that they were like elevated like 2,000 feet above like the ground. That element really brought this sense of tension to it, this sense of like what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of organic, diaspora that you could derive from that, even though parts of it were really not great.
Yeah, I guess the resolution is the knowledge they have to get down.
Yeah.
One way or another, this story ends when they reach the ground. It's like the gravity, the location is
yes.
Yeah, exactly. And it's got a really good twist too. I will say that there's a very good twist in it.
I guess what all these things have is an arrow that's pointing very firmly in one direction, and we know it's going in that direction. So some examples of just when I was rattling stuff off for notes for the episode are the entire disaster movie genre. That's all clocks.
Yeah,
when
totally.
you know that the volcano is going to erupt, or specific example, the 1998 disaster movie Deep Impact. At the start of the film, we're told a comet is heading toward Earth and it's going to be really bad when it hits. And there's never any ambiguity about whether it's going to hit. The comet's going to hit.
Yeah.
So it's the tension of when it hits, what characters do in the meantime, the shortening fuse before it does. That is about the most firm example of a hard clock I can think of.
I was thinking of Armageddon.
I mean,
they're like the same movie, right? Like, I just know one of them has that Aerosmith song in it. Like,
yeah, and I think that's Armageddon.
I think you're right. And Bruce Willis is in that one. Yes, don't know about Deep Impact, but same thing.
I think the genre's all it's pretty samey. Okay, here's an example: Romeo and Juliet. Juliet is set to be married to Count Paris. We know it's only a matter of time before the marriage goes ahead, and it's that closing window that arguably spurs Romeo and Juliet towards their self-destructive romance, because they've only got so much time. So it puts this time pressure on the whole story.
Sure.
I just thought of a good one.
Yeah.
Titanic.
Yeah.
It's kind of making the ultimate promise, even before the characters know it's a problem. It's the premise that you've bought a ticket to go and see a movie called Titanic because
it's like
only
a meta
one thing's
clock.
going to happen by the end.
Yeah.
It's like this meta clock. We know, the audience knows, just because of historical context, that this ship is going to go
That's a powerful
down.
tension tool, because it's like,
Yeah,
when
it
do they
is.
hit the iceberg?
Yeah,
How
it's
long
actually,
do they have before they sink? Yeah.
It's just like, you can just imagine that little kid in the theater going like, but when are they going to hit the iceberg? Like, it's very good. It's very good. It's a classic.
Yeah, historical events as a clock. That's a really good point.
That's the power of historical events. Yeah,
Totally.
How about pregnancy? Pregnancy is a ticking clock.
Yeah, Juno, right?
Sure. Or Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah.
Very different films, but we know, there's 9 months, right? There's something's going to happen at the end of the 9 months, and we know that the clock is ticking down. And I haven't seen Juno, but is the climax of the film kind of around the point of the birth?
Yeah, it kind of is. Yeah.
Or how about the holiday season? We've got 1 month until Christmas. Will the family overcome their troubles? Oh, Christmas is coming. Is it going to be a good Christmas or a bad Christmas? The example that I've got is Love Actually. I mean, that's, I don't know if you guys have seen it recently, but it's got like a 2 weeks until Christmas at the bottom of the screen, and then 10 days till Christmas, then 1 day till Christmas. And you know that the characters, for better or worse, have to resolve whatever's going on by Christmas, because we know that's the deadline.
Yeah. Home Alone, similarly.
Yeah.
One I'm very interested for. So I haven't actually read it yet, but we're talking about Brandon Sanderson again, the mad bastard. So he's released 4 Stormlight books, and the end of Stormlight 4 promises the premise of Stormlight 5, and it basically ends on this cliffhanger that there's going to be a battle of champions in 10 days. This gets decreed.
Yeah.
Like, as readers of epic fantasy, all these other books have taken place over spans of like months and almost a year, and then we're being told the next Stormlight book is going to be the duration of 10 days.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
One way or another, either the big bad will get defeated in 10 days, or all the good guys are going to lose, which might happen in 10 days. And so even before he sells the book, he's a mad genius. We know the next book is a 10-day clock to resolve everything that he spent 4 books building. Like, what a maniac. What a clock that is.
That is really good. when I taught this as a class, one of the students I had put their hand up and said, but when we're doing a clock, that gives away the ending, right? Because we know that one way or another, this event's going to happen. Isn't that a problem? What do you guys think of that? I mean, obviously, in the example you gave, Ali, we don't know if the good guys or bad guys are going to win, but we know there's going to be a battle. Is that a problem with clocks? The idea that we're giving away the climax to an extent?
I don't think so. I think the nature of a story is such that it is a climax. You know, like the whole point of a climax is it's building tension up to a thing that you don't know the outcome of.
Mhm.
So in Ali's example, like we don't know what side that's going to fall on. We don't know if the good guys are going to win or the bad guys are going to win. When the volcano goes off, is the family who live under the volcano, are they still going to be there? Are they going to be able to get out of the town? Like the whole notion of it is the unknown. It's the Schrodinger's cat of like,
Yeah.
well, does it survive or doesn't it? You know, so I don't think so. I think that's kind of part of it. What an interesting thing that you can do sometimes is actually just dispel that tension entirely and say, "Oh yeah, I died." You know,
Yep.
like this is my ghost
Yep.
recounting this thing. Let me tell you the story of how I
Yep.
died. And there's still tension in that because stories about finding out how we get to the point. It's the old cliche. It's the journey, not the destination.
Yeah.
So you could go right up to that line and go like, "Hey, I'm giving you the answer now. This is how it happened." You
I
know?
think even like in works like that, though, even if we know the outcome, often there's something like a twist that makes us change how we see about the outcome. Like in that example, maybe we know that the narrator dies, but it turns out that the narrator perhaps killed himself, or that they were a really bad person and they're the villain, something like that. So it changes the way we see that inevitable outcome.
Yeah, I feel like I was going to say a younger Ali probably would have agreed with that sentiment. I understand what that's rooted in. You're like, where you want your story, you're like, I want to surprise the audience. I don't
Yeah.
want to tell them it's going to happen. But I guess the more and more I write, the more and more I see the value in the tension, giving them the pieces. Like the tension is more valuable than any twist, I suppose, because you want every moment in the lead up to be as dramatic as it can be. And I talk about stories as opening and closing brackets a lot. And it's the same thing you were saying, Alex, and we'll talk about it with guns, that if you introduce something, there's only going to be so many outcomes that can be. And the fun speculation is great. We've introduced this. So how is that going to pay off? Is it going to be an X, Y, or a Z ending? And it's the expectation manipulation, I guess, you can have along the way, teasing the audience. Is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? And it's so rather than an infinite amount of surprise ending, there's probably only 4 or 5 ways this is going to shake out, and it's letting them stew in which one that's going to be. I guess is the fun.
And how that looks specifically. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely agreed. It boils it down, and actually that can make it even more stark and interesting. Coming back to Chuck Palahniuk, something he does in his work Survivor, which is really interesting, he numbers the pages backward. So it starts at like page, let's say 248 or whatever, and it counts down to 1.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The story has like a strong clock in it as well, but the fact that you're turning and every time you turn a page, it counts down. I remember reading that and thinking like, God, this is good. Why didn't more authors do this? That's really clever.
Yeah. And I guess there's a meta game we're playing with audiences these days, because all readers, all viewers have an inherent understanding of story structure to a degree. They know they're going to sit through a setup, they know stuff's going to happen, they know there's going to be a climax. So it's if that's a given, then it's up to us to it's almost the unexpected bits are how we're going to tie those bits together. I guess that's where the freedom and the fun is.
What new things are we doing with existing pieces?
Yeah. So Banshees of Inisherin, I think, does the promise of literally just telling you what's going to happen really well. Especially just in its premise, 2 people, they're not friends anymore, and the story is working out why. And it gets to a beat where I guess you'd call him the antagonist, says, if you keep bothering me, I'm going to cut off my fingers. and we're running in kind of this dark comedy that has a lot of funny, pithy dialogue like that. So it's like, he's just said something morbidly funny. But the movie ticks along, and maybe 20 minutes later into the film, he's throwing his fingers at this guy's door. And it's just the perfect payoff of, you kept bothering me. I told you if you kept bothering me, I would cut off my fingers. And it's the follow through.
Such a good segue, because I would argue that might be a gun.
Let's
come. Ooh. Oh, don't you love
I
a
mean,
good
especially
segue?
if he shoots him, right?
So if a clock sets a countdown timer for when events are going to come to a head, a gun subtly suggests, and subtly is the operative word, how the inevitable chaos will occur. Again, coming back to Chuck's definitions, the chaos is when everything kicks off and everything goes crazy. So like what you were saying, Alex, it comes back to the idea of Anton Chekhov, the Russian playwright. He had this concept of, if there's a gun in the first act, the gun's going to go off by the third act. He was talking about it more for economy of elements in a story. Like, don't add a gun in the first act if it's not going to go off. Like, what's it doing there? Bring it down, make it simple. But the idea is kind of mutated to mean something that we place in Act 1 that's subtly kind of hanging there over the mantelpiece. And by the time Act 3 happens, we've hopefully forgot about the gun over the mantelpiece. Maybe it's been suggested again, maybe not. But when it comes back around, it's at once surprising and at the same time inevitable. So we go, aha, oh, the gun. Of course, I knew it was going to go off, but I forgot about it because there was the romantic subplot and the plot with the dog and the fight and everything else. And that feels really, really satisfying. So I haven't seen Banshees of Inisherin, but that's a gun, right? We're told you're going to cut the fingers off, and we're like, maybe he's serious, but you probably forget about it, I'm guessing.
You forget about it until he does it.
Until the fingers hit the door.
And then it's inevitable because he's like, he promised him he would. That was the contract.
Yeah. Surprising but inevitable is exactly how Chuck defines it. And it is important, I think, that the audience forgets about the gun for most of the movie. Yeah. If it's hanging there the whole time, then it's like, okay, well, of course that was going to go off.
Yeah.
So it's not a sword of Damocles. It's a gun on the mantle.
Can you define a sword of Damocles for us?
Oh, well, something that we're talking more the disaster movies, I suppose. We've been told this is the threat. We can always see the threat. The threat is always coming and it's going to fall.
Yeah, I think, Alex, that sounds like it's more like a clock, especially if maybe the thread of the sword of Damocles was getting thinner and thinner. So whereas a clock should be explicable, should be over us all the time, the gun is, it's there.
It's subtler.
It's subtler. It's there.
These things don't need to be used in tandem. They are you don't necessarily need both in a book or a screenplay or whatever. You can certainly have both. But you don't necessarily need to use both or either, but you can.
Yeah, I totally agree.
There's the quadrant, like there's both of them, like one of them, the other one, and none of them,
Yeah, and I'm sure there are plenty of great works that don't have any of these, but when they work, they're really, really good. Yeah. One example of a gun that I have is Stephen King's The Shining. Alex, do you want to cover what that is in The Shining?
Yeah, I do. And just for the sake of fairness, we did pilch this off Chuck's original article. So, but it is a really good example. So basically what happens is at the beginning of the book, and I want to be really specific here, it's the book, this is not the movie, right? So what happens is the main character, Jack Torrance, comes up, he's going to be a groundskeeper. He meets the old groundskeeper, who's this guy who seems a bit sort of like a little wacky, little crazy. He's like, oh, hey, you got to watch out for this boiler. Like, you got to make sure you keep it at level, because if you leave it too long, it overheats and it'll blow up and it'll take out the whole thing. So that is like an almost perfect Chekhov's gun, because at the end of the book, spoilers, the whole thing does basically go up because they've forgotten about this. And it's not as if it's just this one time that's forgotten about. There are a few times where early on, Jack has to go out and check it. So we're not, it's not as if it just comes out of nowhere and you're like, oh yeah, that thing he briefly mentioned. Like, it's there. If you look for it, you can recall that it is definitely there and it has been sort of in the in the aegis of the the plot, but it's not immediately apparent, and that is the Chekhov's gun there.
That's exactly it. It's hanging over us. It's nice and subtle, but when it happens, like, oh yeah, that was going to blow up. That was always going to happen.
Yeah.
Alex, do you have any examples of guns that you've come across or used? Or
I rattled through all my mental catalogue of Brandisons, and there's some in there, but then I realised I actually think George R. R. Martin is better at this specific technique.
Okay.
And with specifically the Daenerys plotline. So thinking of book 1, it's the dragon eggs, and maybe the show's not quite as subtle with it, but the book does a very good job of the 3 dragon eggs are just a wedding gift at the start. And at this point, Game of Thrones, the book, is making a big deal about magic isn't real in this universe, where we're just a whole bunch of infighting houses for power. Magic's not a part of this world. Maybe there was magic once. I don't know. Leave that to the priests, but there's no magic. These are just remnants of history, but we thought it would be a pretty wedding present, but they are literally stone. Knock, 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 the stone. And she's like, great, thank you for the pretty wedding gifts. Meanwhile, Daenerys
nice
has her plot. Like, her goal isn't trying to hatch dragon eggs. Her goal has nothing to do with dragons. Her goal is... it marries with her new husband's goals and surviving that situation, and her dick brother getting through that. So we are led to forget about these items. I think every time they camp in a new place, maybe there's a small moment where she likes to take them out and display them. That's as much attention dragons are given at all. Meanwhile, POV is jumping. Ned's losing his head elsewhere. Other very dramatic things are happening in Game of Thrones. Right at the very end, when Daenerys decides to burn the witch that murdered her husband, essentially, spur of the moment, she's like, look, I'm going to commit suicide and I want to be burned with my pretty dragon shells. Maybe she has an instinct in the moment where she does this. We don't know. And then we get dragons. And it's just this very inevitable, of course, this is what the entire plot's about. Of course, the entire 7-book run is going to be Daenerys raising the dragons, taking the dragons back to Westeros, getting the eggs at the start. Of course, the only possible payoff of using them is getting dragons. Dragon eggs equals dragons. But I thought it was just handled very subtly. And in less deft hands, it would be really obvious and on the nose. But George is very good at constantly reminding us this is not important. Maybe a less subtle example. I've got one other one for the Daenerys, her character, which the show didn't do. I think we see hints of it where she buys all the slaves in, I think, season 3, book 3. And there's a specific whip they give her. They're like, this is the whip that if you hold this, they will obey you. All the Unsullied will obey you if you hold this whip. And it's this sign of oppression, I suppose. So she kind of hates it because she's like, I'm here to liberate them, but I guess I will hold the master's whip. Fast forward to book 5. I think the show does it a little bit, but not as well. It's when she's in the dragon pit, the dragon fighting pits in the Free Cities. And Drogon's gotten loose. He's a big boy. She's not really in control of him. He's been terrorizing the city. And it's this confrontation with Drogon. He lands in the dragon pit. He's going to eat everyone in the arena. And she picks up the dragon whip. And she tames Drogon for the first time with the whip that represents oppression and taking control in a forceful manner. And it's the first time she gains control over her dragon that was otherwise going to burn everything. So she had to pick up the symbol of the master, but that's the whip she used to tame her dragon. And it's just such the themes, that's so good. Love that. And then again, it's just this perfect payoff of you give Daenerys a whip, and then of course she's going to turn into a dragon tamer now that she has the whip. And it's just like, satisfying. That's good shit.
Could that potentially be more foreshadowing for what we might know might happen to Daenerys later in the story? Taking the whip? Huh?
Taking the whip. Well, we don't know how Game of Thrones ends.
No, we don't.
Because there's still 2 more.
We may never.
Hashtag not my show. But that is the beautiful arc she's on, if done correctly, is she doesn't want to do this, but it's the only way she can achieve her goals is through this.
Yeah. You mentioned there that it works because it's subtle. I mean, particularly the dragon eggs, it's hinted at, and I mean, I think famously when a gun is bad, it's really, really obvious. Like, sure, would be bad if the guns over the mantelpiece were used accidentally. Yeah, that would be terrible. Do you guys have any examples you can think of where you've seen a gun that doesn't work well for whatever reason?
I don't know if this counts, but there's a lot of shonen anime that I still love regardless, that I feel like run on this rule. Like, I feel like a gun under Chuck's definition needs to be a physical object. He's quite clear about that, isn't he?
Is he? I don't know. I mean, I could see it being a concept maybe, or
maybe it's more of a concept because shonen's very good at being like, here's a power-up. here's the potential of where the character could be. And then, time rolls on and they just, I sat under a waterfall and now I have that power-up and now I'm going to use it. And it's like, that feels a bit cheap. Some shonen are really good at it and it's not cheap, but lazier shonen, you see the power up coming a mile away and you're like, just hurry up and learn the thing.
Yeah, often in the same episode, like,
like,
there's this thing. Oh no, I'll never be able to control it. Oh, then the big bad comes and it's like, oh yeah, I've got the wings now that previously I couldn't wear and now I can, and I can fly and kill him. Like, it's just silly stuff like that.
I guess with a lot of writing, though, it's tricky because we don't always know what's too obvious and what's obvious enough. We want to show the audience and we want them to know and forget about it. But at the same time, if we're too subtle, they could miss it. So hopefully this doesn't discourage anyone from actually trying to use this. And as with everything, use beta readers and use,
With a Chekhov's gun, less is definitely more. Like, it needs to be introduced at the beginning, more or less at the beginning. And then it needs to be alluded to, probably not in the context of like, oh, this could be a bad thing, but just casually. Like, for example, in The Shining, where he has to go back and check on the generator, and it's like, oh, that's fine. But then you don't hear about it for a really long time, and then when it does become a big thing, you're like, oh no, we forgot about that. It's, and then it blows up and it's a whole thing. But yeah, I'd say like a light touch. You could. I wouldn't go so far as to codify it with like a rule of 3, but like, once allude to it, depending on how long the story is, maybe allude to again, maybe not. But then have the payoff.
And I guess the reason the Daenerys thing works really well for me is because eggs and the whip were introduced under different circumstances that weren't immediately related to their payoff. They paid off in a different way, but in an inevitable way. So the eggs were important to her, and she kept showcasing them because they were important to her because of her family. And there was a family plot happening where she was fighting with her brother, and they would argue about what it means to be of the House of the Dragon, and the dragon eggs were a symbol of that. So they had their significance in the story that wasn't, these are going to become dragons until they did.
Even reading that back again, because I read it for the first time a while ago. Reading that back, I was kind of surprised when that happened. Like, it catches you off guard.
Yeah.
Even having seen it on the show, it's like, oh yeah, right. Now she gets dragons. So yeah, so cool.
What clocks and guns are really, and they're many things, but I see them as coming down to a promise, either an overt, obvious promise in the case of the clock, or a subtle, I'm going to promise it, you're going to forget about it, and then you're going to remember the promise by the end of it in the form of a gun. And it's the promise of something big's going to happen. It's the clock, it's the countdown to the climax. And in the gun, it's the promise that this is the thing that's going to cause the chaos, and it's going to be great when it happens. So they're really useful for that because they remind the reader as we go on, this is going to be exciting. Like, you're looking forward to something. It's like we were saying at the beginning, sometimes if you can't see the excitement coming up, you wonder, well, why am I really reading this? And hinting at it early can be really good. But they can also be really effective, I think, for us as writers. When we include a clock and we know that there's a countdown, that kind of reminds us that actually I can't dilly-dally with the story because the clock is ticking and the tension's going to have to rise as the clock goes. Or if we include a gun, it means that sooner or later that gun's going to fire, and the longer I leave it, the less relevant it's going to seem. I want to ask you guys if maybe even if you didn't know it at the time, if there's ever been a situation where you've been writing and maybe you haven't found the point or you don't know what the ending is going to be, or you think like, gee, maybe a clock or gun would have been pretty useful in that situation, or a time when you did use it and it was really effective.
Yeah, they provide a really strong scaffold. I mean, particularly the clock, but yeah, both sort of things, elements provide this really strong sense of like start and finish, which is essentially all a story is. It's a beginning, it's a middle, and an ending. And if you can have an overarching thing that can very elegantly tie those things together in an appropriate context, because as I said before, you can't always or don't always need to use them both. I just think it's a really elegant tool to keep things going, and depending on the genre and stuff as well, I can see there being a clock of some description in in any kind of literary or commercial fiction. Like there's a time, yeah, like Romeo and Juliet. There's a countdown to how long until they're going to get married, or until the inheritance runs out, or something like that.
Yeah, that's good.
There's actually a very subtle clock in the book I'm reading right now, which is where basically the author's money is not the main character, who is an author's money is running out, and like him and his wife become more and more antagonistic until it finally gets to a point where he's like, I can't do this. And that promise is fulfilled, and it's a very nice complete arc, because we've known it's happening, and it kind of comes to that. So yeah.
And I'm guessing if I was the author of that, if I was ever thinking like what should happen next, well, the money dwindles more and that causes another argument, but it needs to be bigger because the money's smaller.
Yes.
So it would lead the author to write the next part naturally.
I can't say I've used it intentionally, but now that we've given these devices names, I feel like if I ever feel a lack of tension, because I think it's quite right that a story can stand on its own merit without using these devices, there'll be enough other elements creating pacing and tension that it works perfectly fine. But if I ever find myself being like, oh, there's a sag here, events are happening and the characters are moving towards their goals, but why isn't it pacey? Why isn't there tension? I'll probably look to guns and clocks to see if there's a way I can just tighten that. Just spitballing, I think one of the next books, when I have free time to move on to a new project that I'd love to write, I think we'll have a terminally ill character. I want to try dealing with that.
Oh, that's good.
Thematically, as exploring that thematically, but as a literal clock and also a bit of a gun. It shapes the timing and the plot resolution of the story. So then the story's just in the lead up to that.
Yeah, it's a good frame.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We didn't even get into the idea of illness as a clock, but I think I wouldn't call it a subgenre, but when I was doing research, there's a bunch of different works that use the idea of illness as a clock, and it seems very powerful.
Yeah, and it's kind of that aging even, and the bucket list genre would fit into that. I feel like Up, the Pixar movies, even leaning on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to summarize, clocks and guns, they're both really useful to build suspense and tension throughout your writing. The clock sets a countdown for when events are going to come to a head, while the gun subtly suggests how the story's inevitable chaos will occur. Both devices, when used correctly, are really powerful for making your story that much more exciting, but also to keep your own story on track. So if you're ever in a situation where your story is floundering, you don't know where it needs to go, you don't know what should happen next, consider clocks and guns as devices in order to keep you on, like Alex said, the scaffold of your writing. So there's much more to say about this, and I'm sure many of you guys listening will have some ideas of your own, so send them through to us. We'd love to hear about them. We'd love to even discuss them on the show. If you have a question or an interesting comment, we've got our email address in the little description below and all our socials. Check us out there. And if you've enjoyed today, please consider giving us a review. It's the only way that the algorithm can really see us, and it really helps us out. And Ali, I believe you have a quote to close us out.
Yes, we were looking for quotes on tension and suspense, and we jokingly said, oh, let's try and find someone other than Oscar Wilde, because he's always guaranteed to have something good to say, but surely we could find someone else. And then we didn't. So here's an excellent quote from Oscar Wilde. The suspense is terrible. I hope it will last.
Oh, I love that.
He's so good.
He is always excellent.
He's amazing.
Well, guys, thanks for joining me. This has been a lot of fun. I hope I feel like I've learned something through this discussion.
Yeah, it was
You
good.
do.
And until next time, we're Precipice Fiction. We'll see you again with more writing tips and tidbits. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye.
You're listening to Pros and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.